Okay. The loaf of bread sat in the kitchen, waiting to be sliced and put in the toaster. He looked around the room, wondering what kind of person lived in this house. It was a small hovel in the middle of a swamp. The smell would be unbearable for most, but this particular loaf of bread likes the smell of onions and rotting liver. Suddenly, the door was slammed open, and the loaf of bread heard a loud shout. "What are you doing in my swamp?" The loaf of bread was curious. Who could have such a beautiful voice? Was this the owner of this home? Would he eat the loaf of bread? Would he slice him up and put him in the burning toaster? The loaf of bread was excited to see what this mysterious creature would do to him. All of a sudden, the creature walked into the room, and the loaf of bread finally saw the face of an ogre. The loaf of bread knew it. This was the most beautiful creature it had ever seen. The loaf of bread blushed, self-conscious about his one true love seeing it in his home, not knowing how it got there. Of course, it knew that Shrek wouldn't care how it looked. He knew that they were soulmates. It was love at first sight. The loaf of bread couldn't help but imagine their wedding day with all of its friends weeping, seeing the loaf of bread get married to its one true love. "Stop it," the bread thought to itself. "You just met him. You can't be picturing your wedding day already." But this bread couldn't help it. Seeing Shrek in his fabulous wedding gown, all of his friends, the croissants, the donuts, maybe even his brother Rye Bread might show up. And of course, he can't forget Shrek's family too. Donkey, Puss in Boots, and his slutty ex-wife, Fiona. It would be perfect. Shrek would become the loaf of bread's husband, and they would live happily ever after in the small hovel in the swamp. Shrek's point of view. Shrek was pissed off. He had spent all day trying to get Lord Farquaad to leave him alone. Lord Farquaad kept coming to his house and trying to convince him to be best friends. Shrek didn't need a best friend. He was fine on his own. He didn't need anyone. That's what he kept telling himself, After being bullied back in high school, he didn't think anyone would ever want to be with him, much less be friends with him. When he met Fiona, he thought that changed. He could finally trust someone who loved him for who he is, someone who loved him no matter what, or at least that's what he thought. He would never forget the day he found Fiona cheating on him. The day he walked in through the door and saw her on the bed making out with the one and only Donkey. Donkey looked at Shrek straight in the eyes. He could see the anger building up inside of him. "Get out of my swamp." Donkey quickly skedaddled out of there, and Shrek finally made eye contact with his once lover. She looked at him with worried eyes, in fear that Shrek would never forgive her. "Shrek," she said quietly, almost a whisper. He looked at her in the eye, trying to stay as strong as he held back tears. You heard me, Fiona. Get out of my swamp." She slowly made her way to the door and looked back at him a final time before leaving. Shrek sat down in the chair and finally let the tears roll down his face. He would never forget how he felt in that moment, and sure as hell would never forgive her for what she did. Now that he was living on his own with no ring on his left hand, He was lonely. Sometimes he wishes he had forgiven her. Granted, she was a hoe. They were happy together. They could have tiny ogre children playing in the swamp together, and someday they would have children, making Shrek a grandfather. Trying to get the thought of his slutty ex-wife out of his mind, he went to the kitchen to make some food. Little did he know his life was about to change for the better. When he stepped into the kitchen, he finally saw it, the inanimate object that would change his life. Shrek ran over to the loaf of bread. He didn't remember putting it there. Did someone break into his house? Was this a blessing from God? Whatever it was, Shrek was moved by the loaf of bread. He could already tell that they were soulmates. Chapter 4. Third person point of view. The bread was blushing as much as a loaf of bread could. It waited for Shrek to reach the kitchen. That's when he would finally be with his lover. When Shrek reached the kitchen, he looked at the loaf of bread straight in the eye as he opened the cupboard and pulled out a toaster. Shrek slammed the toaster on the counter and forcefully plugged it into the socket on the wall. Shrek picked up a knife and slowly brought it down to the loaf of bread. He slowly pushed the knife down into the loaf of bread. The loaf of bread would have made a noise, but it could not talk, as it is a loaf of bread. Shrek picked up the slice of bread that he cut off and brought it to the toaster. When he dropped the bread in the toaster, he could already feel the heat engulf it. The bread was in agony. It spent 2 whole minutes in that toaster. It had felt like ages, but suddenly, the toaster popped up. It sent him flying out of the toaster. The bread looked down at its body, which was now crispy and a dark brown color. The bread was happy and hoped Shrek liked it too. Shrek and the loaf of bread had been together for several years now. They were now standing at the altar at their wedding. The loaf of bread stared in awe as it saw its soon-to-be husband walking down the aisle. Shrek was wearing a beautiful gown. The bread would have teared up at the sight if it had tear ducts. When Shrek got to the end of the aisle, it looked at his lover with tears in his eyes and said, "I love you." The loaf of bread was overwhelmed with emotion. He could tell that his friends and family and even the whore Fiona supported their relationship. All of their friends knew they were in love. Shrek. Do you, Shrek, take this bread to be your lawfully wedded spouse? I do. Do you, nameless loaf of bread, take Shrek to be your lawfully wedded husband? The loaf of bread did not respond, as it is a loaf of bread. I now pronounce you husband and bread. Okay, and that's it. That's the whole thing.